Good afternoon. Bonjour. Akwaba. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm pleased to be joined by Porter Diehl, Deputy CEO, and Devon Long, Co-Head of Investment Implementation from Bridgewater Associates. Welcome. As you may know, Bridgewater has partnered with Global Citizen and Harif General Partners to support the World Bank 21st IDA's replenishment. And we wanted to spend some time today diving deeper into the research that they provided to the World Bank on the trajectory of Sub-Saharan Africa. We've heard so much about Bridgewater today. Porter, I'm going to start with you. Can you start by sharing a bit about what Bridgewater is and how Bridgewater got here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and it's an honor to be here with your excellencies as well as honored guests. So Bridgewater is commonly known as the world's biggest hedge fund. And for us, we've been on a mission for the last 50 years to understand how the world works. And we believe it works like a machine, where you can map the cause and effect linkages that drive it. And then we use that understanding to manage money and also to advise our clients as well as policymakers, both about what's happening in the world and also about how their actions can change that over the coming years. And for those of you in the audience yesterday, you heard our CEO, Nir Bardea, talk about the call to action from World Bank President Ajay Banga. And Ajay, when we asked him how we could help, he said, help with the 21st IDA replenishment. So that's what we're doing. And for Bridgewater, what that looks like is having our research team, which was led by Devon, look at the continent, understand the trajectory of the continent, and also understand how different actions from policymakers, like the successful IDA replenishment, as well as how the private sector can change the trajectory. So that's what we did. We looked at three things: current trajectory of the continent, how policy actions can change that, and also what we'll be monitoring over the years to see how that is shifting. And we partnered with Global Citizen, as well as with Harris General Partners on that mission. And now, for us, it'd be great to have Devon get into it a bit more, but the short answer to your question on why we're here is, one, Africa has enormous potential and matters so much, as Ajay said earlier, for what global progress will look like over the coming years, as well as for us, it's important to understand what the big themes are that are happening in the world, and that's here. And finally, in that context, we want to use our capabilities to humbly help.
Awesome, thank you. I totally agree with the potential part. And I think part of how we actualize this potential is through research and finding out really where are the areas where we should work on. And by saying Bridgewater is one of the largest hedge fund, I mean, over $120 billion under management. That is really serious capital that can make a big difference. So I'm going to move on to Devon, because I know that your team is the one who kind of led this research. And I wanted to know, how did you approach it? And if you could share more.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to your excellencies and honored guests in Côte d'Ivoire for hosting us. It's really a privilege to be up here. As Porter sort of alluded to, we approach understanding the world through the lens that the world operates like a machine. Economies and markets work like a machine. And what we're trying to do is break that machine down into the cause-effect linkages, understand those linkages from the perspective of data, logic, and analytics, and then put those pieces back together to build a framework. And then use that framework to answer questions like, how can actions by certain players or actions by policymakers lead to different economic outcomes? So that was the main lens we approached this topic from. And I think some of the big things that popped is this question of this demographic dividend and the shift from where working age population will be as we go into the future. And then on top of that, what are the key drivers impacting development financing and impacting economic development in the region? Then what do we think it takes to get the region on a steeper trajectory? And then finally, what can the key players, policymakers, the private sector, and of course the World Bank do to push us on that steeper trajectory? And for us, a really important part of this research was actually going out and talking to all those players and really understanding things through their eyes. So we talked to policymakers both in Africa and in the United States. We talked to sort of thought leaders on development economics through our partners at the Center for Global Development. We talked to private investors, including on-the-ground practitioners like our partners at Harris Capital, and of course talked to the World Bank. And it's so great to be here and sort of see all those perspectives represented in the audience and here on stage. I think it really does take all those perspectives coming together to build a holistic understanding of the challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, Devon. And I want to follow up on this because for me as a finance person, my answer to everything is always more money, right? So based on Bridgewater's research, one, can you talk about how to address these barriers that you mentioned to attract more capital? Because we do need more capital from the private sector to agriculture, healthcare, education. There's so many sectors that actually will require more capital to develop. And how do we push this development to the next stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's probably three things I'd lay out. One is I'll just talk a little bit about, as you say, the need for more investment and what we describe as the investment gap.
Yeah.
Second, I'll talk a little bit about the potential role for the private sector, but then also some of the barriers we see today. And in particular, talk a little bit about what are the ingredients you need for private sector to really come in at scale. And then third, talk a little bit about the role that World Bank and IDA specifically can play in catalyzing that change. Yeah. So, on the investment gap, yeah, I mean, quite simply put, we think there's the need for more investment in the region. Something like 2x is our rough estimate. And, when we say investment, what we really mean is things like core infrastructure. So the roads, the ports, the electric grids. We mean investment in human capital. So healthcare, education, food security, a lot of topics that have been discussed on the stage these past couple of days. And we mean productive capabilities, so factories, offices, data centers, et cetera. And I think it's very intuitive that the things I'm describing are the ingredients that make an economy work. And if you want more output, you need more of those ingredients. So we think it's very clear that the overall level of investment in the region needs to go up. And then if you look at the private sector, we think, and both domestically and international private capital, we think there's enormous potential for that group of players to play a huge role in closing that gap. And then the reality is those flows are happening only modestly, not at the scale that's needed so far. And when you go talk to private investors, so our partners at Harith and other folks who are in the room with us today, there's three big things they always raise as obstacles to investing in the region or as ingredients that you need before other private actors come into scale. So one is these sort of big macro cross-cutting risks. So probably currency is the biggest one, but also political risk and other macro risks like inflation. Second is organizational capabilities, good governance, regulatory frameworks. I think Pavel said it very succinctly yesterday when he said that businesses need clear rules enforced consistently. I think that's a very good description of what it is. Anyone who's tried to start a business knows that that's such a crucial ingredient. And then third, I think, is more development of the core infrastructure. So the roads, the ports, the electric grids. If you're going to come to the continent and build a factory, what is the infrastructure you're plugging into to power your business and get your goods to support? So I think those are the ingredients that you need. And I think there's obviously still a lot of great things that are happening and that are being driven by the private sector. I think Cote d'Ivoire in being here is a great example of that and is certainly one of the incredible development success stories of the past decade. But I think and a lot of these things have already improved and a lot of these ingredients are there, probably more so than many people realize. But I think those barriers need to keep coming down and those ingredients need to keep developing if you're going to see the private sector come in a bigger scale. So then third on the World Bank, I think with that backdrop of the need to really raise the level of investment and the barriers existing for the private sector, not all the ingredients being there, gives them a huge opportunity to really step in and help shape. And, I think of their role as being sort of a first mover or a foundation builder in these development arcs. And I think that comes down to a couple of things. So one is directly lending to and making direct grants to poverty reduction programs in the least developed regions, and especially in sectors like healthcare, education, food security, where the social return is obviously massive. We all know the social return on these things is massive, but there's no capturable profits. So there's very little incentive for the private sector to step in. And then second, help lay some of that foundation and help build some of those ingredients we were just talking about that allows the private sector to come in at scale. So things like actually finance the projects that build the electric grids, the ports, and so on. And I think it really resonates with me how much of an emphasis they're putting on the need for electrification. Second is sort of help build the right policy structures and the right policy frameworks and the right regulatory frameworks that get to that business-friendly environment and make it easier for businesses to come in and operate. And then third, using their partnerships, their programs, their structures, their vehicles to actually go after some of these big cross-cutting macro risks that hold investors back, things like the currency risk and things like the political risk. So, I think they have a big opportunity, and, when we look at a program like EDA, we sort of see it in that broader context, not just the direct impact of the projects it finances, but also the indirect impact it can have by catalyzing behavior in other players and the broader ripple that can have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Devon. And I love how you described those needs. It almost reminds me of the pyramid of Maslow, kind of starting with infrastructure and all the core basic needs of a country. So everything from roads to electricity, and then you go on into human capital, healthcare, education, and those are all aspects that are really crucial to developing the foundation and then getting on to the private sector to actually making investment that will have great returns. So this is really good. Now I'm going to go back to Porter. So we have a very unique audience here, right, that is inclusive of ministers, policymakers, CEOs, philanthropists, change makers, musicians, and so many others, right? How can you first touch on the trends that Bridgewater is watching most closely related to development here in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, certainly. And I think to start, I just want to emphasize what Devon said about the need for investment on the continent to double over the coming years, going from 15% of GDP to 30% of GDP. And that means two things. That means both the level needs to increase, but also the quality of investment needs to increase. So you have to have the return on investment exceed the interest rates that are being paid on it. Now, on your question directly, there's three trends that I was discussing last night with Minister Kaba to see how this is playing out. The first is exactly that, which is what is the level of investment happening, what is the return on that investment, and how is that playing out in productivity? And importantly, monitoring alongside that, how do new investment vehicles, new regulations, how does that change and reduce the barriers to entry that Devon was mentioning? And whether or not the increase in investment creates a self-reinforcing cycle of new investment following the initial investments. That's the first theme. The second is how hard currency debts are getting resolved, and whether or not the resolution on those where they need to be resolved is through a quick and effective process, or if it's drawn out, leading to kind of long-term drags on growth, as well as potentially inflationary spirals. We need to see the debt problems being relieved quickly and effectively. And the third is exactly how programs and policymakers act, whether or not programs like EDA are successfully replenished, and also how reforms, like those that Ajay was leading through the World Bank, how those reforms increase the effectiveness and scale. Each of those threads maps back to the outlook that Devon was saying, and that's exactly what we'll be monitoring to see how this trajectory unfolds.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, and I think we had a little discussion in the corner there about actual investments, and you mentioned that one of the trends is really the level of investment, and conversations like these ones are so important to really kind of bring much more attention to topics like EDA, but also realize that we all have a role to play, especially when it comes to investment in capital markets. Before we require others to come and invest in our markets, we need to be doing our part. So I really like those aspects that you mentioned. So last question, as we'll be closing this amazing panel and discussion. Devon, I wanted to know what surprised you most throughout this research that was conducted?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really stood out to me was sort of just the power of these various multiplier effects you have. So, if you take the United States, for instance, that's where we're from, I like to imagine that if the United States pushed hard for a big replenishment, that other countries would probably suit. So first you get that. If one government acts, other governments will follow. So there's a multiplier there. Then within EDA's structure, as Ajay talked about this morning, there really is this levering mechanism. So each dollar of donation from donor countries equates to $4 of lending to recipient countries. So you get another multiplier there. And then finally, insofar as those EDA projects lead to the things we've been talking about, the building of the core infrastructure and laying the foundation for the private sector to come, each dollar of EDA grant to a recipient country can actually lead to many more dollars from the private sector. So you have these sort of compounding multiplier effects that's really powerful. So a dollar is not just a dollar can really be $10 if it's deployed in the right place and in the right way. And I think we're at an inflection point right now where there's a lot of potential for that multiplier effect.
Thank you. This is amazing because I think one thing that is often missing when we're discussing such topics is data, information, and research. And the fact that this research was done, and as an Ivorian, that it included so many countries, makes me actually really excited. So thank you so much, Porter and Devon, and thank you to the rest of the Bridgewater team and many other partners who are here and who contributed to this research. I know there are copies of the research there for anyone who's interested, and I'm sure the Bridgewater team will be more than happy to provide it to you all. So if you don't mind giving us a big round of applause for this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you to Global Citizen, Bridgewater, Hive Journal Partner for this amazing opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.